Welcome. Today on Gun Owner Against Violence, our guest is the Progressive Party candidate for Attorney General of Vermont. Cindy Hill, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's delightful to be here.
Cindy, before we get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about your campaign and about your background?
Great. I'm an attorney practicing in Middlebury, Vermont, but I do practice here in Massachusetts as well. I've been practicing law for close to 15 years now, and one of the chief areas of my practice is in the area of firearms law. In the last few years, particularly in Vermont, this has primarily meant representing people who've received Brady denials when they go to purchase a firearm. Most of these Brady denials, at least in Vermont, result from mistakes, errors in the records regarding their criminal histories, and it is a rather arduous process to obtain and then correct those criminal histories. I've also represented people charged criminally for use of a firearm in self-defense. I've represented sportsmen's clubs regarding noise complaints, and represented numerous people in fish and game violations. And here in Massachusetts, of course, with your state permitting system, have helped people through that process, as well as FFLs obtaining their licenses for firearms dealerships.
Sure, sure. You mentioned something about Brady denials. What are some of the more interesting cases in that area that you've heard of or been involved in?
There are many common reasons for Brady denials. People often ask, how can you walk into a gun store and with a thing that would get you denied, which in most people's minds means a violent felony, and not know that you have a violent felony. It's actually quite easy. Most of them, where I've represented people, either they're just plain errors on the record or they're very old convictions. The oldest one I've run across was a gentleman who had been convicted in 1945 while home on leave from the service, and he and his companions got in a bar brawl. I think it was an Army-Navy thing, and they all got hauled before the judge and said they were sorry, and yes, they were guilty, and they were shipped back overseas. And never realized until just last year when going to buy a deer rifle that in fact the way that had been entered was as a felony on the criminal record. Many juvenile type breaking into someone's camp and stealing a chainsaw or stealing some tires that were worth over $100 can be classified as a felony.
Sure.
So those are common types of things other than just plain mistakes on the record. Confusing brothers, confusing twins, or confusing people with similar names.
Junior and senior. All
common errors and that lead to Brady denials that are an error.
Sure, sure. Now, are you a firearms owner yourself?
I am. I own many firearms. My whole family does. I think given some recent media articles, we probably own what would be classified as an arsenal. We own handguns, my husband and I both being partial to revolvers. We're wheel gun people. A number of target rifles, a few shotguns. My daughter owns a few target rifles as well, and we do a fair amount of recreational shooting on the weekends.
Great.
Summer evenings.
Do you hunt at all? Or?
I don't hunt, actually. I'm actually a vegetarian. I've been a vegetarian. This is my 20th year, celebrating my 20th year as a vegetarian, so I don't hunt. That is I do fish, but it's a little easier to send them back on their way. I know at least 9 other vegetarian shooters in Vermont, and we've been joking about forming a shooting club and having an annual fall pumpkin shoot. But
there you go.
Strictly a sports shooter, self-defense shooter. I shoot some skeet. Also do archery competitions, but not hunting. Although, as I said, I do represent a fair number of people on fish and game violation.
Interesting. Also, my fiance is a vegetarian, and she doesn't hunt, but she loves to shoot.
Great. She gets another member for the club.
There you go. We'll
another sign her up for the pumpkin shoot.
Sure. On the topic of being a vegetarian, in a lot of people's minds, I think that's probably contrary to the image they have in their mind of the typical gun owner. Maybe the typical image they have is maybe someone who's really conservative. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of your positions that might be contrary to the quote-unquote conservative image they have, and where being a gun owner would fit into all of that.
So I think I would probably politically characterize myself very much as a constitutionalist or a civil libertarian. I do a lot of criminal defense work, and I'm very conscientious and supportive of our civil rights under our state and federal constitutions. And for myself, I see the right to bear arms as a very important piece of our civil rights. And I see that as the piece of our civil rights which protects all of the others, which protects the full political spectrum of debate. Our rights to firearms actually protect not one particular political view, but rather the spectrum of political debate and political speech itself. That is the teeth to our Bill of Rights, and where the power lies to support our Bill of Rights, which includes our freedom of speech, our freedom of religion, and many of our other personal freedoms, wherever they may lie on that political spectrum.
As far as the quote-unquote perception that I was talking about earlier, what is that perception in your mind?
There certainly seems to be a public image of gun owners as this sort of well-off, well-fed, typically white man in his 50s wearing expensive gear from Orvis or LL Bean's, you know, either with an engraved shotgun and you know, driving a Land Rover out to do some duck hunting, or else a sort of militarized version of that same image. But it's definitely an image of a big white guy. And oddly enough, just today on the news, on a newspaper called The Advocate Online, there's an article quoting a gentleman from the group called Louisiana Ceasefire, which is a Louisiana firearms control or handgun control group, in response to the Louisiana governor's reminder to women in the state that they have the right to arm themselves in defense. I guess there's a serial killer or a number of attacks against women that have gone on down there. And the gentleman from Louisiana's Ceasefire said, well, maybe if you're a big white guy who hunts all the time, it might do some good to have a firearm. And that is very much the image of a firearms owner. I know, at least in Vermont, and to some extent all over the state, or all over the country, firearms ownership among women has been growing, not just for self-protection, as you might imagine, but women in the hunting and shooting sports has been growing astronomically. And gun ownership among many other socioeconomic status groups and racial groups has been growing for self-protection. Minorities are actually the top victims of violent crimes in our urban areas, and many of them are looking to firearms for self-defense. So the firearms owners are actually a much more diverse group than that general public perception.
Sure. When it is diverse like that, to what degree do you feel it acts as a deterrent to criminals, if they have this sense that the people from the whole spectrum of society could possibly be carrying a firearm?
It certainly is a much higher disincentive to things like store robbery. If you look at, for instance, an Asian immigrant shop owner, there are, at this point in time, many of our local mom and pop shops owned by recent immigrants from Asia or from Eastern Europe who have saved up their family money and left to find that American dream and go into their own business and buy a shop that the whole family works in. And when that shop owner protects the family's life investment against robbery when they're working late alone in the store, or their young family members are working in the store, by having a firearm on the premises, that creates a deterrent for the robberies of such places. A woman with kids safeguarding her car, and safeguarding her family against carjacking, or safeguarding herself as she's walking out to a parking garage late at night. Someone who comes out of women who work in a late night shift somewhere, a convenience store, or a nurse coming off a late night shift that would be carrying a firearm for personal protection. It certainly acts as a deterrent to those sorts of violent crimes.
So the first part of what you mentioned, the first press release, actually can act as a deterrent. If you're publicizing that the people are armed, a criminal might think twice, thinking someone's armed, and not go
Certainly.
through.
I know a few years ago there was a program in Florida There was a very concerted effort. The rates of sexual assaults, violent sexual assaults, had escalated in some of the seaside areas, and there was a concerted effort to train women in self-defense. And the self-defense training, which was offered, included optional training in regards to firearms, and just that knowledge dropped the sexual assault rate dramatically. And I know that here in Massachusetts, the Gun Owners Action League had reported on that study, and I believe continues to have the data regarding it online or in their, what someone could obtain it from them.
That's a powerful incentive, because the police can't be everywhere, and if the criminals know that someone can possibly defend themselves, they're going to think twice.
Well, it says, I think they call it the rule of nines, and 99.9% of the time, of course, police arrive after an incident with the coroner. Obviously, the presence of police on the streets and in certain areas itself is a deterrent. I don't want to say that it's absolutely not. Obviously, we can't tell how many crimes are prevented by knowledge that there are police in the area. But the secretive nature of things like sexual assaults clearly means that you're not going to be in a place where police will be obvious, and your own abilities are the only thing between you and potential harm in that situation.
Sure. And ultimately, we're responsible for our own lives.
Absolutely.
What is your interpretation of the Second Amendment? Do you feel it's a collective or an individual right? And also, where does gun control fit into that?
The Second Amendment clearly and most obviously is an individual right, does convey an individual right, and it is within a political context. In Vermont, we're extremely fortunate because our Vermont state constitution protects or recognizes far greater civil rights and liberties, and is extremely explicit on the issue of firearms. Our Vermont state constitution says that we have the right to bear arms for the defense of ourselves and of the state. And in fact, in a different part in the Constitution, it actually imposes a duty on us to bear arms or to pay money in lieu thereof. And there's a question as to whether our paid police function has fulfilled that function at this point in time. But gun control is a very recent phenomenon, and it's very troubling to me from a civil libertarian perspective, because gun control on the federal level is really social control. The history of this country is one of violence, of extraordinary violence and bloodshed, and all through all of that, through the Indian Wars and the labor wars and Civil War, there was not an effort at gun control. The Federal Gun Control Act came into effect in 1968. Why? If you think about what was going on in 1968, for those of us who can remember those years, in 1968 there was a perception of certain social groups arming, most particularly black citizens and American Indian citizens, who had been, particularly with the black citizens that had been attempting to procure their civil rights since the end of slavery 100 years before, by the 1960s, it's 100 years later, and they still don't have the rights of citizenship. They were in this effective social purgatory between slave and citizen. They were neither of the above. And there was considerable political upheaval and unrest, and various movements preaching different methods of attempting to finally gain those civil rights, which as citizens they should have been afforded. And there was a perception that some of those groups were prepared to make their point known by way of armed upheaval. And similarly out west, some of the American Indian movement organizations that were again perceived, rightfully or not, as being on the verge of seizing their rights of citizenship by violence, by armed violence. And suddenly Congress, really out of fear, saw the need to pass gun control and remove guns from the hands of some citizens.
Okay.